So, I can't remember if it was a video I did this year or last year. I just can't remember. Um, but there was some pretty record high temperatures going on the last time I made a video, and I mean, in some ways, pretty obvious. I made the video last summer, but this Canada Day weekend was just unbelievably hot. Um, there it was so hot it started affecting my diet. Like my diet actually, well, not even my diet, but my bowels actually were responding to the heat. Um, I couldn't eat hot food, like for instance, because I would just start sweating profusely, and I would just like feel like I wanted to pass out or something. So yeah, just an unbelievably hot weekend, and yeah, I sure hope it doesn't continue, but they say it's going to continue for the rest of the week, so it's something I'm going to just have to deal with. Um, anyway, the point being is, I don't think I've made a video in about 2 weeks now, so it's kind of due. Oh, today's also my friend's birthday, my best friend, and I honestly sometimes I think my only friend, but sorry all my other friends, but anyway, but yeah, he is definitely the closest friend I have, and yeah, today is his birthday, and yeah, so just saying happy birthday to him. He's never gonna see this video because I think, quite frankly, he thinks I'm a dumb piece of shit, and he doesn't quite fancy my videos, but that's okay. That's okay. He helps me in a lot of other ways, and that's what really counts. Anyway, I just listened to the latest Sam Harris podcast, and he was talking to Masha Gessen, who's a pretty well accomplished journalist, gay journalist too, and I'm gonna say something that's gonna sound very unscientific, but I find that queer people have sometimes a very unique perspective on things surrounding sex and sexuality, and I guess maybe because it's an experience that's very young. I mean, we only just decriminalized decriminalized gay sex in Canada in 1969, which is not that long ago if you think about it. I mean, considering the timescales of slavery and women's rights, and well, not so much women's rights, but like slavery, etc. Specifically speaking, gay rights being, same-sex marriage being, ushered in 2005. It's a bit of a recent phenomenon, and I think a lot of people. It kind of reminds me of Trinidad, and having to deal with, not deal with, but well, yeah. I mean, I lived in Trinidad until I was 16 years old, so I dealt with homophobe. I don't like using that word, but I mean, sometimes you just gotta say a word because it just sums up the complicated concept beautifully, right? With a whole bunch of baggage, and that's where the problems begin. But there was a lot of homophobia in Trinidad, and I mean, just a couple of months ago, the Supreme Court in Trinidad ruled that same sex is now decriminalized. But there's a lot of backlash. There's a lot of anti-gay rhetoric. Surprisingly, the Supreme Court or the prosecutors did not use religious grounds as their backing for their case. And I think that's kind of telling, to tell you the truth. I mean, maybe Trinidad is such a pluralistic society. I mean, you run into like logical errors, like, I mean, which religion, I mean, which excuse do you choose, and how do you know you're choosing the right one? But anyway, they use the constitutional argument. But still, there's a lot of backlash, and considering that Canada only just legalized same-sex marriage, and people like Sherry DeNovo have been working on further rights for gay people when it comes to adoption and gay families and things like that. So we have moved. Don't get me wrong. I'm not claiming that I have no rights in Canada, but what I'm saying is, attitudes change kind of slowly, and I think gay people have this sort of like booming voice these days because of the internet and blah blah blah. But some of that large voice is kind of still being caught up to by prevailing attitudes, like religious attitudes, or maybe more conservative attitudes. I mean, conservatism itself is experiencing this resurgence. I mean, you look at the election of Donald Trump, and places like Italy and the UK. There's a lot of there's a lot of head butting going on. But going back to the point I was trying to make, I think gay people definitely have a unique voice when it comes to something as core as basically sex and sexuality. And they were talking about the Me Too movement. This video is going on way too long, but it's my friend's birthday. But anyway, the Me Too movement, as Masha Gessen kind of summed it up, is kind of like this convolution of sex and sexuality with crime. And while you might think those boundaries are clear, and they should be, and I think they are clear, I think what happens in prevailing attitudes is those things get kind of mushed together. And I think that's what has been happening with the Me Too movement. I think people, excuse me, I think there's and I'm going to be repetitive here. I'm going to be derivative almost, because I just thought that interview between Sam Harris and Masha Gessen was just so beautifully insightful, or just so true, but yeah, the way people think is that once you enshrine this policy of sexual harassment in, say, workplaces or in government, etc., etc., you're looking at basically natural behavior that becomes suddenly criminalized, or more likely to be seen as criminal acts, because that's how people work. So they mention things like clumsy sex or inept flirting, things like that. They all of a sudden there is a policy around that sort of thing, and it's enforceable. I'm sure the powerful institutions behind those policies will enforce them to demonstrate power, to demonstrate social consciousness or responsiveness to to these types of things. But one of the more interesting points that they made was also the sort of spaying, or the sort of dumbing down, or the sort of like inertness that the Me Too movement has given women. Almost like they're sort of like these, if they weren't object before, well, they're objects now. And I'm sure that you could spin that however you want. You could say, well, men are objectifying women, or etc., etc. But I think women are doing it too. They're these innocent players. And I would go one step further, in criticizing the Me Too movement than they did in the podcast I just listened to, and say that women aren't that innocent. I forget the name of the comedian that was on SNL last Saturday night, but she made a really insightful joke. And maybe I'm the only one who saw insight in it. But she said, the joke was basically like, if your dick is out and the woman has all her clothes on, something's wrong. But if the woman's clothes is, and I'm not a comedian, so don't think I'm gonna make this funny. But she said, but in her sort of like post punchline, she said, but if the woman's clothes is off and your clothes is on, then everything's okay. And I thought that was pretty insightful, actually. But women are being kind of desexualized, kind of spayed, and kind of made into these sort of like very innocent, sort of passive, kind of docile, innocuous kind of players in the whole sex dealing. And I think that's just simply not true. In fact, and this is a bit of a related topic, but not specifically about sexual harassment. But in Parliament, there are women who harass men. And I think the reports of a harassment are actually proportionally representative of the amount of women and men in Parliament. And I'm sure there's other examples, but that's the last example I remember reading. So I don't think women are that innocent. And I think the Me Too movement definitely takes away the idea that women can be like players in the sexual game. And like I said, I would go one step further and say that women aren't that innocent either. I mean, they're human as well. So yeah, that's the Me Too movement. And then the other interesting point that they brought up was, and Masha Gessen was kind of like insistent that there is no difference between Muslim or Islamic intolerance and Christian intolerance. And she made a good point, because she brought up LGBT issues in Russia. What's happening in Chechnya with the gay concentration camps and things like that, and she she kind of makes a point. But I mean, I think if you look at related laws, like say for instance you look at countries with blasphemy laws, like blasphemous libel laws, right? There's a correlation between those types of laws and basically anti-LGBT sentiment, and other sort of conservative issues. Um, and I think if you look at Muslim majority countries, you'll definitely see a kind of really conservative kind of agenda. And when I say conservative, I don't mean just Christian conservative. I mean, you know, you're talking about laws that are kind of that are basically, like, you know, well, in some cases, capital punishment for crimes against religion, right? And I think those countries happen to be Muslim majority countries. But I will say that Masha Gessen, when talking about, you know, Christianity and the way Christianity can be conservative, she's not wrong. Christianity can be quite nasty. I mean, we've seen it before, and a lot of, like, I've looked at a lot of different scripture about women's issues in different versions of the Bible, no matter when they were published and when they were revised, etc., etc. They all pretty much say the same thing. I know you could talk about interpretations and, you know, the whole rigmarole about interpretations and stuff, but I mean, you know, in a lot of different denominations, in a lot of different types of Bibles, different versions of different eras, etc., etc., they still talk about the same kind of stupid, backward, kind of, you know, antiquated ways of thinking about gay rights, women's rights, you name it, right? But so yeah, she's not wrong. I'm just saying that, you know, and Sam has kind of brought up that study in the UK as well about Muslims and their second generation Muslims in the UK that have very conservative views about homosexuality. So I mean, you know, it's definitely a religious kind of thing. So yeah, that actually does still prevail. And you know, in Trinidad, again, another example, you know, of just anti-LGBT attitudes that just die really, really hard. I'm sure there's immigrants in Canada that just have extreme views on LGBT rights, except, you know, the laws of the country kind of go counter to what their attitudes are. So I mean, they, you know, obviously it's not as pronounced, but I'm sure these attitudes cross borders. I don't doubt them, and they exist for a while. I mean, right into their kids, into their children's attitudes, right? So so yeah, that's basically my video. Maybe I was a little bit too rambly. It's gone on for 12 minutes now, but I think that's pretty much a wrap. Okay, bye.